Good afternoon. On behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture by Professor Ari Joskowicz about his recent book, Reign of Ash, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust. My name is Michael Rothberg, and I have the privilege of serving as the 1939 Society Samuel Getz Chair in Holocaust Studies here at UCLA, where I'm also affiliated with English, Comparative Literature, and the Leve Center. Today's lecture is our annual 1939 Society Lecture in Holocaust Studies, and copies of Professor Joskowicz's books will be available for purchase after the event. I'm grateful to the 1939 Society for their support of our programming, as well as to our campus co-sponsors, UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies and Department of History. As always, I want to thank the terrific staff of the Leve Center and our terrific director, Sarah Stein, for everything they do to make these events possible. And before we get started, let me just ask you to please silence your cell phones. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce Ari Joskowicz, who is Associate Professor of History, Jewish Studies, and European Studies at Vanderbilt University. Professor Joskowicz received a master's degree in history and philosophy from the University of Vienna, which is his hometown, and he received his PhD in Jewish Studies and History from the University of Chicago. Ari is the author of two important books, The Modernity of Others, Jewish Anti-Catholicism in Germany and France, published in 2014 by Stanford University Press, and Reign of Ashes, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust, published in 2023 by Princeton University Press. Ari has also co-edited a book with Ethan Katz called Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times, which was published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2015. And he's the author of numerous articles in important collections and in prestigious journals such as Jewish Social Studies, the American Historical Review, History and Memory, and the Jewish Quarterly Review. A 2011 essay on Heinrich Heine, published in German Studies Review, won the German Studies Association DAAD Article Prize. He's been awarded a number of distinguished fellowships by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Judaic Studies, the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies, and the American Council of Learned Societies, among others. His first book, The Modernity of Others, was a finalist for the Jordan Schnitzer Book Award of the Association for Jewish Studies. The Modernity of Others considers how European Jews sought to secure a place for themselves in different European nation-states by taking part in debates between liberals and Catholics and by deploying anti-clerical and anti-Catholic rhetorics. In making this provocative argument, Joskowicz inscribes Jews within larger European debates about liberalism, enlightenment, and citizenship that still resonate today. Indeed, one of the hallmarks of his work, which we also find in his latest book on Jews and Roma, is an attempt to situate Jewish history within larger comparative and transnational frames of reference. It's an approach that allows us to perceive and understand Jewish particularity, but to see that particularity in relation to other particularities and as part of larger historical processes. His new book, Reign of Ash, Roma, Jews, and the Holocaust, which is the subject of today's lecture, is a truly original and thought-provoking study. Reign of Ash won the Wiener Holocaust Library's Ernst Fraenkel Prize in Holocaust History and was just named, I think yesterday, a finalist for a National Jewish Book Award in the Holocaust category, so congratulations on that as well. And it's sure to have a lasting impact on how we think about the Shoah and about the relation between the different victim groups targeted by the Nazis. It should also have an impact on how we teach the Holocaust, because it calls on us to address one of the most obvious peculiarities of the Nazis' genocidal policies that many of us, and here I speak for myself at least, quickly push aside. The clear parallels between the genocide of Jews and the genocide of Roma, and the equally clear asymmetry in how we evaluate, narrate, and remember those two intertwined genocides. In focusing on both the parallel traumatic experiences of Roma and Jews and the tangled but unequal aftermath of those traumas, Reign of Ash offers what one reviewer, I thought quite correctly, called a completely novel achievement, a rich and honest portrait of how Jews and Roma experienced genocide and its aftermath, both in relation to and apart from one another. In tracking that unusual relationship, Reign of Ashes asks us to rethink some of the signal moments of grappling with the Holocaust. For instance, early projects for the collection of survivor testimonies, such as that of David Boer, and famous trials, such as the Eichmann trial and the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. In these and other examples, Ari reveals how frequently Romani victims and survivors show up in post-war attempts to understand the genocide of Jews, and also how often those references are shunted aside or even serve paradoxically to make it more difficult to grasp the genocide suffered by the Roma across Europe. Ari's handling of the complex and charged relationship of Jews and Roma is a model of nuance, ethical sensitivity, insight, and innovative method. I could say much more about the book, which I admire greatly, but I do not want to take any more time away from our opportunity to listen to the author himself. So please join me in welcoming Professor Ari Joskowicz, who will speak about Reign of Ash.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. I feel it. After such an introduction, it can usually only go downhill, so I apologize. What you see here in front of you is, well, what we have are two groups and one event. Roma and Jews and the Holocaust. And when I speak about this topic, the term that really needs most explanation usually is Roma. So let me start with them. Let me start with Roma, who are approximately 10 to 12 million people in the world, people who they're historically called Gypsies. They are extremely diverse group. They have multiple religions, Protestant, Catholic, Muslims, Orthodox Christians. They have many different ways of living, and I think the image that many people have are of people who are itinerant, which is indeed the occupation of many Roma in England, Western Europe, and some in the US. But that is not the majority of Roma, and it's not the majority of Roma in the countries where most Roma live, Central and Eastern Europe, where Roma have been settled for a very long time, and certainly settled by the time of the Holocaust. Many Roma will identify with a shared language called Romany, but identified doesn't mean that every single Romani person will speak it. It has many dialects. They also have historically groups that have not spoken it. There are many shared traditions, and yet there will be traditionalists who among Romani groups will actually frown upon intermarriage between Romani groups. All of this is just to give you a sense of diversity, and just to complicate and underline that diversity, there are also multiple terms that Roma will use for themselves. And yes, Roma is the term that we use in English, but other groups that I will mention will call themselves something else. When they are in Germany, they tend to call themselves Sinti, and that's relevant because the Holocaust will start in Germany. So, and there are other terms for them as well. Like the Jews, as you know, Roma were persecuted by the Nazis, but unlike them, their story is rarely told. They are Europe's largest minority, but in general, they don't show up in textbooks. I'm fairly certain I can assume that they were not in any textbook that you ever had, either in European history class in high school or in a college class. Nor will they be in a museum if you travel to Europe or anywhere else when it's a national history museum. So the fact that what we know about them tends to actually just be that they were killed. So in that sense, yes, we know very little, too little about their Holocaust, but that's just a symptom that we know even less very often about the rest of their history. My own path to this field, to this history that is obscure, came through the history of the Jews. came through that link that the Holocaust created through both. And what I want to show you today when I talk about this is that these links happen in some expected ways, but also in some unexpected ways. So let me first take you to a location where the Romani Holocaust is commemorated. I mentioned already, you won't see it in your usual museum, but there are a few places where you can see Romani history displayed. And the first to do that really is in the city of Heidelberg, where the first permanent exhibition was created, mostly on the Romani Holocaust, but also to some degree on Romani history. And if you were to enter this exhibit in Heidelberg, this is the sentence that you would see. So this is just the opening, basically. The genocide against the Sinti and Roma was executed with the same motive and of racial hatred, with the same intention, and the same will to systematically and definitively exterminate as a genocide against the Jews. And this statement comes from, well, you can see here the German President Roman Herzog. He said it when the exhibition was opened, and it was put there. The same sentence is the opening of the exhibit in Auschwitz-Birkenau, where the museum, where there's a pavilion that commemorates the Romani genocide. It was even discussed as the inscription on a monument, a central monument to the murder of Roma and Sinti in Berlin. In the end, a different sentence was chosen, but this was discussed. And the sentence shows you how central the Jewish Holocaust is for communicating the history of the Romani Holocaust. It's very easy to see how the equivalent would never even be conceivable in a Jewish institution. If you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., you would never, well, not just is it not there, but you would never even, nobody would even suggest that you would try to communicate what happened to the Jews by saying they were persecuted with the same motive as the so-called Gypsies. It wouldn't make any sense to do that. Nor would you have such a statement on a monument very clearly. This just gives you a bit of a sense of the asymmetries when it comes to this type of representation, but it's also true when it comes to just knowledge about it, to testimonies, for example. And actually, this city houses the institution that has the largest audio-visual testimony collection on the Holocaust at USC, the Shoah Foundation. Its visual history archive has over 50,000 interviews with Jewish survivors and 406 interviews with Roma and Sinti. Now, depending on how you see that, you might say, well, that's a small part of the archive. But that makes it, by far, the largest archive of testimonies on the Romani Holocaust. So what you see here is really the dependence that you have when you research that in that field on Jewish institutions. You want to research the Romani Holocaust, you have to work through Jewish institutions. It's a fascinating and I think singular case, or rare case, of one minority physically owning much of the memory of another group. So having said all that, I should say that many Jewish survivors, and also those who claim to speak for them, will concede the Roma suffered like us. I think that's actually become good form in many forums, in many contexts, actually since the 1980s. There was an awareness that the Roma had a forgotten Holocaust, a forgotten genocide, and that it should be commemorated. But I want to here again highlight a small difference, an important one, which is that when Jews say the Roma suffered like us, that's not really the same as when Roma say we suffered like the Jews. So they suffered like us and we suffered like them. Sounds like the same thing, but it is actually the exact opposite. They suffered like us is a concession. That still leaves you as the arbiter we suffered like them is a demand for inclusion. Now, when one makes such observations about these asymmetries, I think there are different places where one can go. And one place is where people tend to have gone in the past is comparison. They will say, well, okay, I get it. We see these things are treated differently, but maybe there's a reason. And then people will talk, for example, about, well, maybe there's a difference in just the enormity of the event. Maybe victim numbers matter. Maybe methods matter. Intentions matter. Maybe there's something there that we should investigate. I think that these types of comparisons often work with, well, certain common sense, and the common sense hides particular assumptions. So what is the problem with these types of comparisons? And it's really grand comparisons, because some comparisons have historically always happened. In fact, the comparisons start with the victims. At the very moment that it happens, people compare what happens to them to what happens to the people around them, basically. But nevertheless, there is a problem with precisely this type of argument. And the first one is, I think, that we don't have a way of deciding what the criteria are. Let me give you an example from perhaps the country where I'm from, Austria. Austria, you could say 64,000 Jews were murdered in Austria, and approximately 9,000 Roma. And if I put it that way, you can see why the Jewish Holocaust would be seen as more central. But I can also give you the percentages. And I could tell you 1/3 of Austria's Jews were murdered, and 80% of Austria's Roma. There's no way of adjudicating what is right or wrong. There's no, yes, you can make it, you can say it's empirical, but there is no empirical way of deciding what a good comparison is. And more, and that's the second part. Because whenever I even speak in those terms, and I think sort of one senses it, it's incredibly callous. There's something off about counting in these terms. So what we end up doing by these comparisons is ultimately playing down, really undoing our own understanding of the suffering, rather than actually creating knowledge. There's the final problem, which is how do these comparisons actually work out in reality usually? Not in the abstract, but in reality. And if we look at the history of these comparisons, the institutions that started comparing were not historians, but courts. And the reasons why courts started comparing Jews and Roma is because of compensation payments. Because there were agreements to give Jews compensation, and Roma asked for compensation. And what the courts did is they started to compare, and they became extremely rigid in how they would compare, going through exact checklists and saying, well, was it a barbed wire fence or a regular wire fence that was there? When exactly, what a sign, how visible was the sign you had to wear? Is it exactly the same? Was this a year later? Is that the same thing? They became very precise about comparing with an intention. So there is a bad track record to comparing. Okay, so I told you what not to do, right? Fine, where do we go from here? Well, my suggestion is, if we want to think about Jews and Roma together, what we have to do is think about their relationship. Think not about comparing first, but how the actual relations between members of both groups at the time and in their struggles for recognition, how these relations shape what we actually know about the Holocaust. Before we start to compare, we need to understand that relationship. So let me show you what I mean. And to do that, I would like to, begin at the beginning. And there is no real beginning, of course, of the interactions between two groups that have been in Europe since pre-modern times. But for my purposes, the beginning is the Nazi era, because that is when this talk of who suffered like whom started. And if you want, I can talk more about the 1933 period, but I will start us in 1933, which is quite illuminating. Because when Jews, so in the period, we have grand music to underline the advent of Nazism here. When the Nazi regime starts, basically from 1933 to 1939, in the period when it is still, well, pre-World War II, when Jews and Roma were both being persecuted, as far as the sources can tell us, they did not recognize this as similar persecution. That is, sources produced at the time. Once people, after the war, start speaking about the past, things get more complicated. But at the time, that is not the case. If you read Jewish newspapers of the time, both published in Germany, which are censored, and outside of Germany, which are at least not censored in regard to persecution measures, you would not know that Roma faced new forms of internment before Jews did. Starting in Cologne in 1935, municipalities built their own camps, so-called Gypsy camps, on the outskirts of these municipalities, where Roma were in a sort of policed, semi-incarcerated state. And started in Cologne, but by 1936, around the time of the Berlin Olympic Games, multiple other cities started that, including Berlin, Frankfurt am Main, Düsseldorf, Essen, Dortmund, Gelsenkirchen, multiple other cities. And these types of sites eventually facilitated the Nazis' ability to then deport Roma and Sinti. So it is entangled with the Romany genocide. Why did it not show up in Jewish sources? Well, I would say Jews perceived these types of measures pretty much like everybody else around them did, as an extension of much older policies of policing populations whom they deemed problematic, where Gypsy basically stands in for difficult criminal groups that require police measures, if you want. When Germany cleans up the city, it's obvious to Jews as much as to others that perhaps this is just what states do. It's not ideological, like, say, boycotting Jewish stores. When on 1st of April 1933, Nazi Germany boycotts Jewish stores, it's very clear that they are trying to mark something as a revolutionary new thing, and that's how it will be remembered too. That's not the case for these internments. That matters later on, because the first historians of the Holocaust, among them, are Jewish survivors. And others who are not Jewish survivors who will increasingly rely on the reports of Jewish survivors. So the fact that if you go back and if you ask Jewish survivors about what the chronology of persecution is, this will not show up. So when we talk about the history of the Holocaust, 1935, the first municipal camp in Cologne will not be part of your chronology. So we can see how the relations during the era influences the master narrative, the master chronology of how we talk about the Holocaust. Now, all of this changes really once the war starts, once policies really radicalize, once genocidal policies start, and with all of this, things become more complicated because now the other group becomes less of just an image, or a trope. They become embodied beings. So in the process of the persecution, extermination processes, the Nazis do try to keep people apart and to hide these processes, but that is never completely possible. One place where we can see this very clearly is Auschwitz-Birkenau. There's a so-called Gypsy camp or Gypsy family camp. It has the code B2E in Birkenau. And it's right next to the infamous ramp where Jews will arrive. Starting in May 1944, it's built for Hungarian Jews and their extermination. Built, in fact, by Romany laborers, in part, who live in a camp built by Jewish laborers, just to be clear. They will build this ramp, and they will be right next to it. So they are very often the last eyewitnesses, the last victim eyewitnesses who will see these Jews alive. Jewish testimonies also will have a lot of this emphasis on the visual, which generally the testimony genre tends to be dominated by the visual also, because this is what the legal system requires for eyewitnesses. But when it comes to Jewish testimony, the auditory is actually just as essential. There are numerous Jewish testimonies from various camps about screams. One of them is the Lodz ghetto. So Roma were not just in places like Auschwitz-Birkenau, they were also deported to the second largest ghetto in Poland, also to Warsaw, but this is the second largest ghetto in Poland. 5,000 Austrian Roma were deported there. When Jews remember what was happening across the fence, and here they couldn't see again, it's just hidden to some degree. But the memories, and the Shoah Foundation among others, but also other testimony archives have interview upon interview of people speaking of these dreadful screams that kept people up at night. So all of these perceptions really left indelible marks on how people remembered their own experiences. And many of them ended up being tactile too, and these are often some of the most also dreadful experiences and memories of handling each other's dead, both groups being forced to bury each other's dead, ultimately handling each other's property when the others were murdered. But the whole thing also creates a paradox, I should add. One of the paradoxes of these interactions is that all these things that I mentioned now, seeing each other, hearing each other, did create solidarity in the aftermath. People will mention that I feel solidarity with, say, Roma because I remember these screams. Or Roma will say, I feel solidarity with my Jewish brothers and sisters because I remember what happened in Auschwitz-Birkenau. What it doesn't create is knowledge. Knowing that the other person died in awful ways, or another group died, tells you nothing about how they lived. They don't know names. They don't know which language people spoke. They know nothing about each other. The people who will know these sort of things are people who interacted with each other personally. But those interactions were often very difficult. They were difficult because they were under conditions that the Nazis created, often working purposefully to play one group against another, but even where that wasn't the case, in a situation where resources were scarce. Some of the testimonies that would leave the greatest impact come from these types of interactions. The most famous one is from a group of Jews who were deported from northern Transylvania. So this was Romania and became Hungary, and they were deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and there for between 2 days and 2 weeks, different testimonies, different timelines, they were in the so-called Gypsy camp, and the people who were their capos, who were in charge of them, were German Sinti. And memory is of these Sinti being particularly violent. And one of the people who remember this is Elie Wiesel, who was one of the people deported there. It's actually one of the key moments in his famous book, Night, where he remembers that his father got up and asked politely in German, "Excuse me, could you tell me where the toilets are located?" The Gypsy, as he calls him, stared at him for a long time from head to toe. He slapped my father with such force that he fell down and then crawled back to his place on all fours. I stood petrified. What had happened to me? This is the key point when he realizes he's helpless. So this becomes an episode. And again, these don't usually stay isolated. Elie Wiesel will be in charge of the Holocaust memorials construction, basically, and will have fairly bruising conflicts with Romani representatives afterwards about what it means to be included. So again, I think experiences and post-war interactions matter here. But what matters here too is precisely this sense of, yes, knowledge, interactions don't go hand in hand necessarily with solidarity. So that's one of the things I think we can learn from looking at these interactions. The second thing we can really learn is that everything I told you now does not rely on central policies. One thing that people have been doing when they looked at comparisons, which again is the natural place where people go, is they look at orders from Berlin. They say, this is the theory that the Nazis had about Jews. This is the theory that the Nazis had about so-called Gypsies. As you can see, the interactions are not shaped by this. They are shaped by something local decisions on how to deal with the people who are being persecuted. And then finally, what we can see is that what brings together Jews and Roma is not necessarily a shared history of suffering. There is an element here of suffering next to each other, much more than with each other. What will bring them together is the attempt to document the injustice and to repair the injustice. So that's where I want to take you next. And to explain how these interactions work, I want to show you a fairly unusual document, a document that I found unusual. And this is a document that you can find in the Jewish Community Archive of Vienna. It's next to a whole lot of lists, and lists were essential in the post-war period to establish rights. This is next to lists that include some on food distributions. If there's a list on Jews who came back from camps after 3 to 3.5 years in concentration camps. That's the list right next to this one, which has my grandmother on it, which is why I also found this list fascinating for me personally. The lists come from an organization created by the Jewish community in February 1946 called the Action Committee. It's a longer title. But that Action Committee was created to help Jews, basically, who were being excluded from a lot of the reparations measures that the state was putting in place to help people who had been persecuted. So Jews were themselves struggling. They create this organization. And as you can imagine, the lists are about Jews. Every list, except for this one. And this is a list called List of Gypsies Registered with Us. And it has 33 names on it. And perhaps let me just tell you about two of the people on this list. And as you can see, I anonymized those whose death couldn't establish for privacy reasons. The two people I will talk about are dead. And they really are the people who bring together these families, which most of them have the name Husak, Gusak, or Horvat. And the two people are Adolf Gusak, or Husak, their names switch, or Hermine Horvat, who are sort of the older people bringing together these two families that ended up registering here with a body created by the Jewish by the Jewish community. So both were scarred by what they had experienced. Gusak lost his first wife and his son in the camps. Horvat lost her parents and 4 siblings in the camps. They had nothing to return home to, really. So Gustav didn't have much to begin with because he was an orphan who was raised by a priest. Horvat's family had a tiny house in the Austrian province of Burgenland, just 200 square feet with a small vineyard. Neighbors had taken it and simply didn't return it. And there was a commission on this later on all these expropriations. That was standard. None of the Roma got back their property after the war. So in the summer of 1946, they end up somewhere in Lower Austria. They go to Vienna, and they end up trying to find some form of certification, very clearly. And it's at that moment that they end up here with this organization, because there is no equivalent organization that would help them. There is a general organization for all concentration camp prisoners, which is run by former political opponents of the regime, who have no interest in having anybody in their organization who might be deemed asocial, criminal, or somehow doesn't fit their idea of the heroic pure victim. So it's Jews have to push to even be accepted, but they are fairly frequently looking at the files. They will just reject Roma, saying category of gypsies too dubious for us. Jewish organizations will not do that. So very often, Jewish organization will accept them, and then they will be denied by the central organization. And it's not surprising that they would be together to some degree. They do have similar experiences of liberation. And the first experience of liberation is usually trying to figure out what happened to the rest of the family. Both will try to find their relatives. They both will encounter hostile neighbors. Neither anti-Semitism nor anti-Romany sentiment will go away. Most people feel they were themselves victim in an awful war, and these people coming back is unfortunate for them. So neither will be welcome. But there are also big differences. So to some degree, when they are looking for family, when they're trying to rebuild their lives, they will work with kinship networks wherever they can, wherever kin is left. But Jews have the ability to work also with international organizations that have a long history in Jewish life. Starting with organizations that have been there since the 19th century, but the most important one will really be the American Joint Distribution Committee, which is founded in 1914 to support European Jews. They will be crucial in supporting Jewish so-called displaced persons. And the result is, among other things, that some Roma actually pretend to be Jewish DPs, I should say. I have very nice testimonies from people who say they had false IDs to pretend to be Jews. So all of this really creates an incentive to connect to Jewish networks. But ultimately what Roma will need, what people like Husuk and Gusak will need for compensation is a historical narrative. This is where things get much more complicated. This is the first level of getting recognized, being on a list. But the second is on a list for what? What did they experience? And to explain the challenges here, I want to tell you about a book. It's a book that is a bit awkward because it's a book that was never written. So even though it was never written, it was not written by a particular author. So the person who did not write that book, his name was Gerald Reitlinger. And Gerald Reitlinger was a very interesting person, a British art historian, scion of a banking family, who wrote a book in 1953 already called The Final Solution, which was basically the first big history of the Holocaust, as it would be later known. And it was extremely successful by the standards of such a book. It was eventually translated to German. All the prosecutors, when they started to try to put Nazis behind bars, they were exchanging precisely that. They were giving each other that book. He wrote some other books as well, one on the SS. It's called SS Allied by Abomination. He had good sources to do this. Among other things, the Nuremberg trials created a good number of sources that you could use to write the history of what we call the Jewish Holocaust. So by the late 1950s, he had written his books and he was thinking about writing a new book. And so he was chatting with his publisher. And his publisher is an Austrian Jewish emigre by the name of George Weidenfeld. And George Weidenfeld had a lot of money at that point. Again, for a very peculiar reason, because he made a very good decision. He published Nabokov's Lolita. And as you know, Lolita was prohibited in the U.S., and nothing sells like a prohibited book. And he had the English language rights and some other rights as well. So he was doing decently well in the money front. So he's chatting with he has money. His author's looking for a topic. He really cares about the history of Nazism. So he comes up with the idea, why don't you write a history? You already wrote the history of what happened to the Jews. Write a history of what happened to the Gypsies, he says. Write a history of the Romany genocide. So how do you start that? How do you write a book in the late 50s? Well, you try to write to people. He had relied to a large degree on these documents. He had relied on the Vienna Library, which was the oldest archive of the Holocaust, really. It was already founded in 1933 as a documentation center. There's voluminous correspondence, how they lent him books and he never returns it. So we know he used it extensively. He delivered them to his estate, actually. He just didn't return them. So what's the equivalent? There's no Vienna Library for the Roma. Well, there is one organization which actually has very little. It's the people who professionally study Roma, called the Gypsy Lore Society. and others had tried to write to them actually and failed. So he wrote to the survivor organizations. The biggest one, really, the most influential one, is called the International Auschwitz Committee. And Weidenfeld happened to also work with the head of that committee. Again, he made a very good publishing decision. He bought the rights to the English, and I think the Spanish rights, to the biography that the commander of Auschwitz had written in prison, which again was a bestseller and still assigned, and students are really gravitate through this. So he talked to Lang. He told him, I have this author. You guys talk to each other. And this was supposed to be how the book was supposed to come to be. So he writes to Langbein, and the result is that Langbein has to tell Reitlinger, responding to your letter, I have to repeat that currently material about the fate of the Gypsies in Auschwitz is not available in a collection. And then Reitlinger says, well, if it's not in a collection, I'm not writing a book. Because this is a secret about historians. When we rely on archives, we really rely on other people's work. Civil servants who have done the work for us to put things into a nice order. So this wasn't there, so he said, then I'm not writing a book. Langbein was pretty annoyed, writing George Weidenfeld, later Lord Weidenfeld very soon. Reitlinger seems to have expected that I would have sourced all sources all collected and ready for him. He was outraged. He wasn't just outraged because he realized how historians work, but also because he understood what the stakes were. What the stakes would have been for the people he had actually worked with in Austria as part of this committee, who could not say, look, this is what happened to me. Here's a book by a famous publisher in the UK. This is the stuff that happened to me. Now could I have compensation payments? Do you understand what happened to me, etc. He understood the price, basically. So what it took to change all that are collections. What it took was precisely the thing that Reitlinger is looking for. It's not just about people having a good intention of writing a book. What you need is an infrastructure for it. And it was eventually Jewish institutions that would create precisely that infrastructure. Were institutions like the Vienna Library, actually. And the Vienna Library was the earliest institution to collect testimonies. They had in 1938, the so-called Kristallnacht, they collected testimonies back then already. They had a visionary leader of their research department by the name of Eber Reichmann, a German Jewish emigre, who collected testimonies. And in 1957, they started collecting testimonies in Vienna, including some Romany testimonies. And she wrote to this interviewer in Vienna saying, we are especially keen to get testimonies from Gypsies. And eventually they would collect things like here, the interview with Adolf Gussert. So when I told you just earlier about the story of one of the people on that list, how did I know about that from a person about the list? Well, it was because somebody else did the work. This Jewish archive basically paid somebody to collect the story, the life story of this person in the 1950s. And they soon passed away. And I mention here not just that they did it, but also how much they paid, which might seem cynical. Why write how much you pay for it? But ultimately, it's to underline of what it takes. Not Reitlinger's good intentions. It takes resources to do all this stuff. It takes a lot of resources. It's not just the equivalent of $150, which paid for somebody in Vienna at the time to collect this. There will be a team in London indexing all of this. And I think 4 people overall work with all these testimonies. There needs to be an archive that survives. That's not clear for any of the archives. Today it seems these are huge, well-funded archives. That's not clear in the 50s and 60s at all. It needs so much to get all of this to us, for it to be produced to begin with, so that we can find it and that it doesn't just disappear again. And that is exactly what these Jewish testimony archives will get us. The people who will do all these things, I should say, some of the things they have in common is they will all be Holocaust survivors themselves. They're not the new leftists. They're not the 68er generation. These are Jewish survivors writing mostly for other Jewish survivors. The idealism of a new generation basically does not change any of this. And second, So the individuals who will do this, some of them are a bit complicated, I should say. Some of them will call themselves communists rather than Jews. And have Jewish background will say they're communists, and they'll have different identities, but they'll all rely on Jewish networks. That is, Jewish institutions will back them up, no matter what they call themselves. In this case, it's the Claims Conference, actually, that has an indirect way of financing them, paying Yad Vashem to buy a copy of these testimonies so that they can then pay the person in Vienna to collect it. So, there are multiple, it's a whole network that creates the ability to do this. And these networks are ultimately Jewish. And ultimately, the first book that will be the equivalent, what Reitlinger was supposed to be writing, that first book to be a survey history of the Romany genocide, will appear in 1972, The Destiny of Europe's Gypsies, written by a Jewish communist and a non-Jewish, non-Romani activist. It will be funded by the Vienna Library, which has the archive of the production of the book as well. So I will now fast forward. We won't stay in the 50s, we'll go straight to the present. And I want to talk about how the asymmetries I just talked about, that I started with, that I talked about here now, they will persist. That won't go away, and yet everything changes as far as I'm concerned. Because these interactions in the 50s and all the way to the 1980s between Jews and Roma were sporadic. They were really marked by an asymmetry that had no place to be articulated. This was just happening, basically. It wasn't discussed. That changes in the 1980s and 1990s. A, it's being discussed openly, and B, you get new generations, especially in the last 20 years, actually, of Jews and Roma who are ever more similar in the way they are educated, they professionalize in a world of NGOs, self-exploit with unpaid internships, meet at the buffet of a meet and greet in the European Parliament where there were, which is sort of part of that internship track that many Europeans will do. So you get more and more Roma and Sinti and Jewish activists who will have similar histories. And you will get more and more reciprocity. And one place where you can see that really nicely, I believe, is the internet. So here's just one example, just to give you a bit of a sense. On the left, you can see a posting from a group called Ternipe, which is a really large Romani youth organization. It does heritage trips to Auschwitz, modeled on the Jewish heritage trips there, actually. And they posted, in commemoration of a terror attack, of an anti-Semitic terror attack that happened in the German city of Halle. So 1 year after that, they posted in commemoration of that. And then right after that, you have the Jewish students of Germany lighting Jewish, so the ritual candles for the celebration of Hanukkah. So you do one every night has a candle. In this case, it's one candle per human rights concern. So here, using sort of a gender-neutral way of saying Roma and Sinti in German, they reciprocate to their friends at Ternipe basically by saying, and we commemorate, you're one of the candles. And perhaps even more explicit, this is the two organizations. It's the European Union of Jewish Students and Piera Namenka, Romany allied organization, who wrote, after COVID-19, wrote a petition due to sort of a health crisis of Roma in that context. And their petition to the European Parliament really ends with, join us in standing in solidarity with Roma in times of crisis. Jewish rights are Roma rights, and Roma rights are Jewish rights. And if you remember where we started in 1933, with two groups recognizing nothing about each other, you can see the distance here. So the asymmetry doesn't go away, because there's one thing about intentions, another thing about resources. That's much more complicated. But at the same time, something does fundamentally change here. And finally, I should add that when I wrote this book, this is happening in the background, and the book that I wrote comes out of these conversations. I don't think I could have written my book 20 years ago. I don't know if it would have been the right book to write 20, 30 years ago, actually. But when I wrote this book, it was really coming out of conversations. I had participating in conversations that were already happening between Jewish and Romany activists, and scholars, I should say. So what I want us to really do is think about this particular case of proximate suffering as a way of rethinking our responsibilities towards each other's histories. And really it's an opportunity to rethink what it means to have unequal alliances. And to do that in a context where, as far as I can tell, unequal alliances are the only alliances to be had. Thanks.
So much, Ari, for a terrific lecture about a really important and wonderful book, and I think now people can get a sense of why I do think it is so important. We have some time for questions and discussion, and actually I see a hand right away, so I will go right to Todd Fresnick.
This is great. Thank you so much, Ari. There's so much important research that you shared with us. And there were two points that were mentioned. One Michael mentioned at the beginning, were the testimonies of David Boer, I think in 1946, with mention of Roma among the many people that he interviewed, about 120 or so. And then you mentioned, of course, the large collecting efforts of the U.S. Shoah Foundation, where there's, I think, around 400 or so Roma testimonies. And my question is about the differences of the ways in which those victims are talking about, remembering. How do they intertwine the testimonies at that early moment, and then at that later moment, the 1990s, early 2000s?
So, yeah, and so one thing I should say, I mentioned archives. The Boer archives are right here. So the research I did, I wrote about the Boer testimonies, and when I had to enjoyed being here on campus. So I could work in special collections here. And so David Boer is somebody who was one of the earliest to record testimonies, I would say. That means in 1946, he would take a massive recording device, a magnet tape device, to Europe, to still war-torn Europe with special permissions to travel, to record the testimonies of, and there he was in his application actually. His application's already fascinating because he says he's doing this, he will tell anybody he will tell different people different things. You might, if you're a scholar applying for things, you might recognize something here. Telling different people different things. He says it's about psychology, he says it's about technology, this is about testing a new device. And to Jewish organizations, which are there, he says, I'm going to interview Jews, which is what he'll do. So he will start in Paris to interview people. And the first interview, when he goes to a suburb of Paris, there's this old age home where displaced persons are now sitting. The first person whom he'll meet will already tell him something happened to Roma. And the first time, I think so he'll hear it 3 times in the first 2 days. And he'll hear different stories. Somebody who will tell him they were awful, they were capos. One person will tell him they had it worst. We had it bad, but they had it even worse. Another person who will try to debunk what the other person said. So by day 2, what Boer will do, and this is what fascinated me in Boer, it's a learning experience. What you can track in Boer, because there are timestamps on these interviews, what you can track is how does somebody who has no idea who these people are, who has no idea that something happened, how does he learn about this? Because by day 2, he introduces questions with, there's a known fact, and then tells, So we move within 2 days from, I have no idea what you guys are talking about, who are these people again, to, there's a known fact. Please explain to me what you know about. Which is how, the question creates the phenomenon. So what Boer will ultimately do, it's a pattern that will exist for, especially late 40s and 50s, when you have a burst of interviews, really, with Jews, which will be, there will be people who will understand that there's something to be asked. There's another big questionnaire in Belgium that will work this way. It's a ministerial one run by a socialist feminist of the interwar period, a Jewish feminist. And she will also ask, Jews about what happened to Roma, not Roma. He will eventually write an article where he mentions he would have liked to interview them, didn't work out. He will ask all sorts of people about Roma. There was one Jehovah's Witness actually who asks about it too. And after she said, I didn't see any Jews, he said, well, then did you see Roma? So that will be the pattern. You will have people who will want basic information. When you get to the Shoah Foundation, the Shoah Foundation itself is founded by Steven Spielberg after the success of Schindler's List. With the proceeds, he will establish this larger effort, largely volunteer-based. So people will be trained to go out and interview people. And this is when people will also start there's an understanding already, there's something missing, so people will ask about Roma. They will first of all start to ask about Roma, they will ask Jews again about Roma. In adequate or inadequate ways, I should say. So it's sometimes awkward because there's a sense of there wouldn't be any answer here. But what you can trace is a new understanding from the very beginning that this is something they should be knowing. Then you get Jews who start to interview Roma. One of them is actually my aunt, I should say, which is a fascinating interview with a leader of the Austrian Romany organization. And one thing that makes it so fascinating is that this is still the 1990s in Vienna, and she lights herself a cigarette, and then she gives him a cigarette, and it's a whole relaxed, very different atmosphere there. So you will get people who are asking Roma. They will. What we can see in the Shoah Foundation. So the attempt to get to Romani populations for the Shoah Foundation is hard, and it's not the only population. The Shoah Foundation also has difficulties getting to Orthodox Jews, for example, who don't want to be interviewed. So they usually work with particular organizations that might have a good purchase on that group. And in that case, they work with two people. One is a professor at the University of Texas, Austin, Ian Hancock, and here they work with the German, mostly Romani Rosa, who's the leader of this German organization called the Central Council of German Jews German Jews. That's not coincidental. The Central Council of German Jews is the name of the Jewish organization, and they simply modeled it on it. They simply copied the name and said Central Council for Sinti and Roma. Central Council of German Sinti and Roma. So they worked with him, which is why the code is, when you sort of a drop-down menu, you can look for Sinti and Roma, which is interesting because not a single Sinti person was interviewed in the end, but it's mentioned first. So what you can see is the traces, really, of of the organization grappling with it. And the places where certainly survivors would have noticed it most is the so-called pre-interview questionnaire. So, if what you see on the screen is not the first time the organization and the survivor interacted with each other. It's a phone call, obviously, but they also are supposed to give them, just a questionnaire where they were, so you don't mispronounce every single place. They can look it up before they go there, the interviewers, etc. So there's a questionnaire. And the questionnaire for most of the early Romani interviews said, so what kind of Jew are you? Orthodox, Reform, non-observant? You can see how, so you get a sense of how this, they're sort of made to fit in a bit. But of course the keywords, the questions, none of that really was geared towards it. It would be as awkward as having the Jews have think, what are you, Kalderash or Vlach Romani? You immediately sense, oh, this is not for me, which is how many of the Roma actually perceive this too. They're much shorter than Jewish interviews. And I'll leave it at that.
Got Sarah and then Ted and then Jerry.
Thank you, Ari. I know historians hate to prognosticate, but I wonder if you could reflect on what sort of reception the book might experience in Austria, or possibly even in Germany, when translated, in light of the kinds of politics that surround Holocaust memory. Of course, Michael writes about so eloquently.
Yeah. So I should say how I diagnosed what has happened in the past 20 years, perhaps, to answer the question, which is that, so in the 90s, Romany testimony, so these Romany claims that they want to be included were sort of explosive. 80s and 90s, it's still fairly new that Jews have a story to tell publicly, that there's a word, there's acceptance, there are college courses. It all seems so, for us, this is establishment. 80s and 90s, it's still decently new. I mean, it's already starting to be established, but it's new, right? Before that, it was hard for many Jews to tell those stories. And in that context, it was hard for Roma to claim inclusion. There was a debate about should they be part of the big monument that the Germans were building for Jews in Berlin. The Jewish community said no. They got their own one in the end, and I think it actually has its own place in the memorial culture. But it's mostly no. We worked on this for a long time. In this case, it was non-Jews who started it, but still, it's basically this is finally our story. Why would we share it immediately? So there was something explosive about it. That has shifted. It has shifted in part because of the politics because of Jewish politics, because of the politics that explode on campuses every single day, which is that since this actually starts in the 1980s, when the Intifada for that Lebanon invasion, there are debates in Europe that make it harder and harder for Jewish organizations to continue the progressive work that they identify with. So they are still in the 80s. There's an organization called SOS Racism, SOS Racisme in France, big organization. Jewish students of France are essential for founding it. It will fall apart. Fall apart around Israel. And that will be, of course, a story that you might know from every campus, right? There are temporary alliances, but there's a sense of insecurity. And it basically comes, the short version of this is, will somebody say Palestine? And suddenly the room freezes and you will see what happens. It doesn't happen with Romany politics. So it's much easier. What was explosive is now the easy part. Okay, yes, we need to share, yes, but that's easier. So I think Jewish and Romany politics became compatible much easier as the other politics became more explosive. So my book the reception also in the US has been very positive from Jewish institutions. There was one exception, I won't go into details, where things blew up because Gaza war came in not through me but through somebody else. Then, as you know, no matter what happened, you don't even need to know the details. You already know it will have blown up. So in Europe, I should say there's a Czech translation in the works. It should be out pretty soon. I don't know about German at this point. My sense is the parts that I think might be more explosive are these questions about Israel, perhaps. But I have no idea how people will react to that. My own when I write about these things, it's a meta-analysis of what can be said, what can't be said, and what are the results of that, rather than saying anything of substance. So I don't know. I think Germans, my perception of having presented, certainly in German contexts, I've presented in Austria and Germany, but in Austria also in English for Central European University. It's a special audience. And in German, I think there's just a nervousness. There's a nervousness of not knowing where is this guy going to go. I think that's my main perception.
Sorry, thank you very much for your talk. And maybe I want to push it into maybe another contested European space. I'm a faculty member here in archival studies, and I work in Bosnia and Croatia. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested in your comments both about infrastructure and also proximate suffering. So, for example, there were work groups that had to take down the Orthodox Church in Banja Luka that were Jews, Roma, mm-hmm. and Serbs. And mm-hmm. I'm sure you're perfectly familiar that the Holocaust history in Croatia is still highly contested and highly inflammatory, particularly around Jasenovac, and how we're sending people also to Auschwitz. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts, particularly about either infrastructure, archival infrastructure. For example, the train manifest records are very controversial in Zagreb, or about the idea of proximate suffering and the Serbs and the sort of Holocaust interactions with the Jewish community.
I feel this. So Jasenovac is something that's actually central. I didn't write about it. So for the Romany Holocaust generally, if we think about where most murders happened, yes, Nazi Germany is important, but the independent state of Croatia, the Ustaša regime, and Jasenovac are actually one of the central locations, as is Romania. So two allied regimes of Germany that actually are drivers and essential part of that story. So it is not just a German story. Which brings me to the point that there's on the one hand I use the word Romany Holocaust, which is sort of homogenizes it and brings together two things which have differences there. But the very term Holocaust, even when it comes to Jews, is homogenizing. There are multiple different dynamics in multiple different places. We're from North Africa to Latvia, basically. Yes, they're all based on anti-Semitism and have there's a common logic to them, but they're also fairly different developments. So I feel it's one of the. So I don't have a good response. What I can give you is my sense of where I feel my own. It's not just the book. My own challenges and failures when I teach the subject, which is the difficulty of articulating how these different dynamics fit in, because the German-centric narrative is convenient for simplicity's sake, actually. It's not just some moral, it's not just, we need to talk about the Nazis, never leave them out. That's right, but it's also, it simplifies things. So the fact that the Ustaša regime centrally targets Serbs, and that in good reason you put, a line, lists of victims, Serbs could go first, and when it comes to Jasenovac, and also in terms of numbers and of centrality for the regime, it's very hard to put into these sort of master narratives where it's the Holocaust, and you want to learn about the whole Holocaust rather than about a country. Same is true like places like Bulgaria, where nationalism is so essential. There are different narratives. It's not just the one, the racial state and Hitler. So for me, the challenges there that I can see as an outsider are conceptual, and have to do with framing. The archival situation, I don't know well enough. I tried to work a bit also on
the
certain
Roma
kinds.
are very, very hard to find.
They are. So I have
They were not
colleagues.
enumerated.
There's several colleagues of mine who regularly also present at conferences where I'm at, who work on precisely that history. But it is really, there's something always. This is also where coming from the U.S. and being in the local context, there's a strange clash, right? Because they have to do darn hard work to just excavate the facts, and then American scholars who want to make the big argument come along, working with the things they have figured out, and there's a certain there's a hierarchy that develops a strange one. So I feel there's just a need for a lot of hard work to be done there, but I do know it's being done at the same time. I do know that I have colleagues in Croatia who are doing it, both in terms of the archival research and the publications, but also in terms of memory work. They usually are integrated into various initiatives. There's a monument for Roma, I think, around Jasenovac as well, and I think it's really
It's off-site.
Off-site, exactly, which is, so it's in that sense, it's clearly not ideal. What changes things sometimes are if the political framework changes, and it sometimes suddenly becomes interesting to do it. Unfortunately, often to deflect from something else bad that's happening. But I feel that's I don't know if that was a hopeful statement, but I think that often changes things.
Yes, a country where the Gypsy population or the Roma population is perhaps prominent is Hungary.
Yes.
Okay, I would like to ask you a couple of questions about that. First,
Mhm.
was Wallenberg tasked with trying to get any help for the Roma, number one?
Mhm.
How did the Hungarians after the war, the Jewish survivors, contribute to their stories, and what was their view? From what I know, my partner was a Hungarian survivor.
Yeah.
They didn't think highly of Roma.
Mhm. Yeah.
So that's why I asked these questions.
So I'm certainly not aware that Wallenberg had any task with Roma, and that's not to the best of my knowledge. It's a complicated story with Roma in Hungary, as it is for several countries, where you both have persecution and early attempts to integrate Roma into the machinery of the state. So where they were soldiers at one point, but then also get arrested and deported at other points, depending on.
Were they taken for forced labor as well?
They were in the labor battalions, yes, exactly, like Jews. But not only. Some of them were also ultimately. It's a bit complicated with Roma because the categorization is also messier. Jewish communities have a longer history of claim making and self-organization, which also means they're highly identifiable. Right, working with civil registries very often, simply. More complicated for Roma, so you also will have Roma who are probably guards in these units as well. So things can get a bit messy. I think Roma will be, especially in 1944, will face these deportations within Hungary mostly. It's also a different story than the deportations to Auschwitz of Hungarian Jewry. The story of Roma, so this also ties now into the story of what happens to Roma under communism, where they do have avenues of social mobility very often. So Roma are identified by the regime as basically a subject of affirmative action, that way. So there is, but at the same time, they are at the lowest on that totem pole. They remain the lowest. So one thing you can see, for example, in urban patterns, there's the district Józsefváros in Budapest, which is, tourists go there now. It's also the Jewish district. It was a Jewish district. Jews leave largely. It becomes a very impoverished district. Roma lived there. Then it's being regentrified. Jews live there again. Ultimately, I think you have I don't think Hungarian survivors are going to be that different from, say, Romanian survivors or others. I think they will reproduce the stereotypes that others have about Roma. I should add that Roma will share the stereotypes of their environment as well about Jews. Neither of them is unique in that sense, in how they think about others. But what you do get in Hungary, more than anywhere else, also more than in Romania, are new alliances between Jews and Roma. And that is something I see. I see intermarriages also between Jewish and Romani survivors. I see even more in the next generation. Actually, so there are some Romani activists from Hungarian background who are both Jewish and Romani. The founder of the Austrian Romani student organization was also in the Jewish student organization, for example. They have tons of projects where they really try to mirror, where especially Jewish activists try to build organizations that mirror what happens on the Jewish side. They are welcomed in these Jewish community centers. And I think what you can see here, and this is perhaps again this, it's a happy story within an unhappy story, I think, which is that these alliances work best where liberal democracy is weakest. That is, Jews and Roma realize that they have common enemies, which is not the case everywhere. Most of the time people think they have different challenges. In Hungary, certainly Hungary went through a period, and I think remains in a period. But especially there were moments of massive anti-Romani violence by groups that were at the same time, posting anti-Soros posters everywhere. There was a very clear sense of this is a government that really has it out for both of us. And it created some form of unity that you did not have in other places. in a sense, you sometimes get more indifference where things don't fall apart quite that much, would be my analysis.
Any other questions? Yeah.
So I don't really know very much about the Roma at all. So I'm just kind of like trying to understand like what their sort of like power structure or lack of power, like, you know, so you have Jews, you have this diasporic thing, and okay, we're going to become traders because we've got this whole network, and then we're going to not own land, we're going to have some liquid wealth, and then we're going to get into all this stuff. So we have these levels of different people, you know, and my people are like the Brownsville, Brooklyn murdering people, and, you know, and there's this whole, like, what was the sort of, was there a hierarchy? Was there ever an elite? Were they ever, you know what I'm saying? I'm like, I don't know enough to ask the question, right? Maybe that's enough.
Yeah. I mean, you end up certainly with social prestige hierarchies within Romani communities. Very often, sort of lautari, the people who actually make music, would have more privileged access to the powerful as well. It's a strange alliance, right? You make music for the powerful. You have no, you know, there will be no intermarriages. You're still frowned upon, but you know, the special role of the entertainer that at the same time would be very different from, say, groups that are just itinerant and repair pots, pans, spoon makers, etc. Ultimately, so you do get that. There is also a tension between traditional hierarchies. So there are traditional forms of law giving, of adjudication. Crease is among certain Romani groups is sort of a big theme among Jews, among traditionalist Jews. So there are, if you want, adjudicating courts, arbitration courts, call them. The problem is really that what is the relationship between modern organizing and these traditional forms, which of course clash in Jewish life as well. But they don't need to clash in that form because the traditional forms are sufficiently weak that they don't matter in most contexts. They matter in the Orthodox world, I would say, where yes, there is somebody who's listed as the CEO and the treasurer or whatever, and then there's the reverend who will decide something. But for most other Jews, there's just whatever structures have been built up over the centuries, really, of political structures, etc. Secular communities, federations in the U.S., which are, again, each country has its own specialty version of these things. I think in Romani life, there's still a tension there between young Romani activists, often younger women who are building new NGOs, and the authorities of the old so-called big man, right? Or people who are traditionally adjudicated, and then there will be a tension clearly between those, which also go hand in hand with, I think, what is called like an intersectional advocacy, because on the one hand you have young Romani activists who emphasize also the rights of gay Roma, say, and traditionalists who want something else when they say they want recognition. So there have certainly been conflicts around these. I don't think they're these I think are really not unique. I think this is in terms of looking around the world, and I don't think that would be particularly singular for the Romani case.
But what I'm asking, I guess, really is why are the Romani not able to have the structures to do their own interviewing, to be right? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Right. I mean, I should say Jews are really unusual in their ability. So the question is, who's the outlier also? And both are outliers of some sort. And right, we're talking about two communities who are, in many respects, on the opposite end, say, of literacy, historically, and illiteracy. Which again, not uniqueness, right? We know in the Russian Empire that it's not Jews, but I think Lithuanians were the most literate. But Jews tend to be on the highest end of the spectrum in terms of literacy. Roma tend to be on the lowest. Urbanization levels. where Roma do sometimes live in cities, but then on the outskirts of cities, moved into the periphery where they are in cities. Jews ultimately become a model for many other groups in terms of self-organization, I would say. In the way they build philanthropic networks. Sarah has written about some of the essential ones here as well. So they are, and Roma will recognize the model, I should say. Roma are not, they're not unique, but Roma will actually, one of the models really will be Zionism, which is one reason that Israel comes up in peculiar ways for Roma, which is this idea that there's something that Jews achieved here that is sort of unachievable for Roma, and it actually is something they don't want. There's a brief discussion about should there be a Romanistan, but there's an agreement that it's a virtual one. It's not going to be a physical one anywhere. Even though I write about one leader who actually has a great idea of moving all Roma to Somalia and creating a state there. It's not like nobody has these ideas. So I think Jews are in some ways really with these networks, again in the U.S. context, not completely unique. I think I don't know the hyphenated Americans, the Irish Americans supporting Irish independence and et cetera. It's not unique that you have these transatlantic support networks, but in I think also the multipolar way in which the Jewish world there is connected. Also Jewish parties that integrate from Bundes, not just Zionists, Bundists, and all these self-organization of Jews across borders since the 19th century. I think that is a unique story, and ultimately it's tied to the unique story of the rise of American Jewry as well. The rise of the joint and the post-war, the particular post-1945 moment of how Jews in this devastated continent can receive support. Clearly, American Jewry is essential. It's a particular story of a particular group in a particular place at a particular time. I don't know if it can be universalized, but it does happen, and there is no equivalent for Roma. One big thing I should mention is Roma. The geography is completely different. If you think of the geography of Jews before World War II, it's a bit more overlapping with Roma, right? Much larger populations in Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe. After the war, at some point, 90% of all Jews live in the US and Israel, at some point at the end of the 20th century. When it comes to Roma, that movement does not happen. They live in the places where they used to live. Given what happened to these places, another asymmetry comes up. This is also true for compensation payments, by the way, because during the Cold War, Germany would not pay any compensation across the Iron Curtain on principle. Since most of the Roma survivors are precisely there, most of the Jewish survivors are not. You get, it's not on purpose, but it is an asymmetry that immediately comes out of what is a migration and geography fact, basically.
Thank you. I've got questions, a bunch of them myself, but we're kind of out of time, so I think we will stop here and just thank you for a really, really rich discussion, a really wonderful event, and thought-provoking in so many ways. So please join me one more time.
Thank you for all your questions.